Indro Falasi had never been surprised. Not once in 43 years of living dangerously, not through 3 wars he hadn't started and 2 he had, not through the 17 men who had tried to remove him from the earth and discovered, too late, that the earth was his. He had built an empire on the simple principle that a man who cannot be surprised cannot be beaten. He read rooms the way other men read contracts, slowly, completely, looking for the clause that would destroy him. Tonight, the marble arch hummed with exactly the kind of tension he expected. The table to his left held 2 Azerbaijani shipping brokers who were not, in fact, shipping brokers. The man near the bar with the champagne he hadn't touched in 40 minutes was either a journalist or a government asset, and since the journalism was worse these days, Indro was betting on asset. The couple in the corner booth were arguing about something that had nothing to do with what their hands were doing, her left hand never straying more than 3 inches from her clutch bag. His eyes moving to the second-floor mezzanine every 90 seconds with the clockwork reliability of a man waiting for a signal. Indro noted it all, filed it, continued his conversation about Tuscany real estate with a man who had no interest in Tuscany and even less in real estate. He did not notice the waitress. That was his first mistake, and Indro Falasi did not make mistakes. She was the kind of invisible that London manufactured deliberately, dark hair pulled back with the severity of someone who had learned that beauty was a liability, uniform crisp, movements efficient without being graceful. Eyes aimed at the middle distance that all service staff mastered, the look that said, I am furniture, I am function, I am not here. She moved through the room like a ghost that had learned good table manners. 3 years at the Marble Arch had given her the muscle memory. The 12 years before that had given her everything else. Nobody in the room looked at her hands. They would not have seen much. She kept them soft deliberately, moisturizing each night with the focused discipline of someone maintaining a disguise. But if anyone had looked carefully, if anyone had counted the faint silvered traces along her knuckles or noticed the way her wrists moved with a fraction too much precision when she set down a glass, they might have asked questions she could not afford to answer. Nobody looked. Indro Falasi did not look. The whiskey hit him at 9:47 p.m. 30 years old, that Scotch. Older than most of the people in the room deserved to be. It came off the tray in a single clean arc, a stumble, a gasp from the table to his right, a suspended moment where the entire VIP section seemed to hold one collective breath, and then the liquid soaked through the black fabric of his shirt, cold against his chest, and the glass landed on the document he had been pretending to review, and the room went absolutely still. This was the moment, everyone understood, when Indro Falasi reached for the thing he kept beneath his left arm. Indro looked at the clock on the far wall. 9:47. He looked at the overturned glass, at the spreading amber stain on the paper, at the young woman standing above him with an empty tray and wide, frightened eyes, the kind of frightened that looked real, performed with the commitment of someone who had learned long ago that appearing harmless was its own form of weapon. He looked at the mezzanine. The man in the corner booth had stopped checking it. His hand was now on the table, visible, still, the posture of someone who had just received the signal they'd been waiting for and was now very carefully not reacting to it. The Azerbaijani shipping broker to his left had shifted his chair, just slightly. Just enough to change his angle. Indro reached up and touched the wet fabric of his shirt. Then he said, in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear it, "You didn't spill it. You were pushed." The room was still waiting for the explosion. His bodyguard near the door had straightened. The asset by the bar had finally taken a sip of his champagne, not from thirst, Indro knew, but because he needed something to do with his hands. Kaye Grant stood holding her empty tray and looked down at the most dangerous man in London, who was looking back at her with the calm, exact attention of a man who had just recognized something he thought was extinct. She said nothing. Indro Falasi smiled, a small, private thing, not meant for the room. "Sit down," he said, before the man on the mezzanine figures out that his shot is still open. Which meant he had already seen it too. A man who has never been surprised just met a woman who sees violence before it happens. If you're listening right now, you need to understand something. This isn't just another spy thriller. This is about two people operating on frequencies the rest of the world can't hear, recognizing each other across a room full of people trying to kill them. My analytics show that 77% of you aren't subscribed yet. But if you want to discover how a waitress who maps violence and a crime lord who reads rooms found each other in the precise moment before catastrophe, hit that subscribe button right now. Because Kaye Grant has been invisible for 3 years, and she's about to become very, very visible. Let me show you who she really is. She was the kind of invisible that London manufactured deliberately, dark hair pulled back with the severity of someone who had learned that beauty was a liability, uniform crisp, movements efficient without being graceful. Eyes aimed at the middle distance that all service staff mastered, the look that said, I am furniture, I am function, I am not here. She moved through the room like a ghost that had learned good table manners. 3 years at the Marble Arch had given her the muscle memory. The 12 years before that had given her everything else. The Marble Arch did not advertise itself. It existed in the way that certain London institutions existed, through reputation and restraint, through the brass-fitted black door on a Mayfair side street that bore no name, no number. Nothing except the understanding that if you needed to be told where it was, you were not the kind of person it wanted. The building had been a private members' club since 1887, a wartime officers' mess between 1940 and 1945, and something considerably more complicated since 1991, when it had been quietly acquired by a property holding company that was itself held by 3 other companies, 2 of which existed only on paper. And the paper existed only in the offices of a Maltese solicitor who had learned early in his career that the most valuable skill a lawyer could possess was a thorough and enthusiastic ignorance. Inside, the air moved differently. Thicker, somehow carrying the accumulated weight of every negotiation, every veiled threat, every handshake that had redrawn boundaries invisible on any official map. The walls were paneled in pale ash wood, the lighting kept low and amber, warm enough to suggest intimacy, dim enough to suggest discretion. A quartet played somewhere in the building's deeper rooms, something slow and melodic and European that drifted through the walls like smoke. The carpets were a deep, arterial red, the kind of color that hid things well. Every surface held the careful geometry of wealth that had stopped needing to announce itself. Crystal that caught the light without demanding attention. Flowers, white and spare, that had been arranged by someone who understood that excess was a form of insecurity. Men in suits that cost more than most people's monthly salary, wearing them with the ease of people who had never considered what things cost, because cost had never been a constraint. They spoke softly here. Even laughter was modulated, allowed, contained, kept below the threshold at which it might suggest someone was enjoying themselves too much or too freely. Kaye had learned to move through all of it without touching it. 3 years of carrying trays and refilling glasses and disappearing between tables had given her a topographic map of this room that she could have drawn blindfolded. She knew which panels in the east wall had been replaced 18 months ago and why the acoustics near the bar had changed slightly. The new wood absorbed sound at a different frequency, which meant conversations near the bar were fractionally harder to overhear from the mezzanine. She knew that the second chair on the left at table 7 rocked slightly on uneven legs, which meant anyone seated there shifted their weight unconsciously every few minutes, useful for distinguishing nervous behavior from structural inconvenience. She knew that the service corridor between the kitchen and the VIP section had a blind corner that the security cameras didn't cover. An oversight that had never been corrected because the management had never considered that someone who already worked there might find it useful. She had noticed the man on the mezzanine at 9:31 p.m. 16 minutes was not a long time. It was long enough. She had mapped his sightlines from 3 different positions while refilling water glasses and collecting empty plates, the calculations running beneath the surface of her practiced invisibility like code behind a screensaver. She had identified the primary target, the only table worth targeting in the room, and worked backward through the geometry until she understood exactly which position at that table created the cleanest angle, and which position disrupted it. She had picked up the whiskey at 9:44. She had not been pushed. But Indro Falasi had said it anyway. She had been 26 when the agency had given her gift a name. Predictive Violence Assessment, 3 words that looked clean and bureaucratic on the classified brief, the kind of language designed to make something frightening sound like a spreadsheet function. What it meant, stripped of its official dressing, was this: Kaye Grant could walk into any room containing human beings and tell you, within 4 minutes, who was going to hurt someone, who was going to be hurt, and in what order. Not intuition. Never intuition. She had corrected that assumption precisely once before learning to stop correcting it, because the people who called it intuition were the same people who would never authorize the budget for someone whose methods they couldn't quantify. It was pattern architecture. The human body, she had written in her first agency assessment, cannot fully conceal intent. It leaks. The hands rehearse before the mind has finished deciding. The eyes mark exits before the person consciously chooses to run. Microtension in the trapezius precedes aggression by an average of 4.3 seconds. 4 seconds is an eternity if you know where to look. They had put her in rooms and watched her work. Simulations, then briefings, then actual operations where the stakes were men's lives and government secrets and the kind of silence that followed a miscalculation that couldn't be walked back. She had been extraordinary. She had also been deeply, structurally unhappy sitting inside the machine of state violence and mapping its geometry with the detached precision of someone who had confused understanding a thing with being safe from it. She had found the mole on a Tuesday in November, 3 years ago, working late on a threat matrix for a Copenhagen summit. The mole was not a low-level functionary. The mole was Deputy Director Harlan Voss, and the moment she understood that, she also understood that she had approximately 72 hours before her own threat assessment changed from asset to liability. She had packed one bag. She had walked out of the building at 6:14 a.m. in the gray London dawn, and she had let Kaye Grant the analyst dissolve quietly into the city like salt into water. The woman who emerged on the other side had learned to carry trays. She had never fully unlearned everything else. They came for her at closing time. She had expected it. Had spent the 2 hours after the whiskey incident completing her shift with the mechanical calm of someone running a very detailed internal simulation, stacking plates and collecting glasses and saying, of course, sir, and right away while her mind mapped every possible extraction route Indro Falasi's people might choose and ranked them by likelihood. The service exit scored highest. The loading dock second. A direct approach through the dining room was lowest probability, too visible, too uncontrolled, and Indro struck her as a man who disliked uncontrolled variables. It was the service exit. 2 of them, broad-shouldered and professionally expressionless, appearing at 11:43 p.m. in the corridor outside the staff changing room with the quiet confidence of men who had done this before and found it unremarkable. Kaye looked at them, looked at the corridor, looked at her watch. Then she went left. Not running, running was panic, and panic was information she wasn't prepared to give. She moved at the brisk, purposeful pace of a staff member who had somewhere to be, which in this building's geography meant she instantly became nearly invisible. The Marble Arch had 17 staff-only corridors threading through its interior like capillaries. A Victorian infrastructure of service passages designed so that the working machinery of the club would never intrude upon its atmosphere of effortless luxury. Kaye had memorized every one of them inside her first month. She heard the men behind her recalibrate, a half-beat of surprise, then footsteps accelerating. She turned through the kitchen antechamber, past the cold storage units, down the narrow passage beside the linen inventory that smelled of starch and industrial detergent. She moved a catering trolley into the junction behind her without breaking stride. Heard it connect with someone's knee. One set of footsteps stuttered. One kept coming. She led him the long way around, through the wine cellar access corridor, Up the half staircase to the mezzanine service level, a sharp right through the AV equipment room that connected, via a door most staff had forgotten existed, directly back to the main service corridor entrance, where the second man was waiting, having simply walked around. He was breathing harder than she was. Kaye stopped, straightened her collar, looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had already decided how the next 30 seconds would go. "Shall we?" she said. The car took 40 minutes to reach a building that was probably 12 minutes away. The route was deliberate. She counted 6 unnecessary turns, 2 of which doubled back on themselves, a classic disorientation protocol designed for people who tracked landmarks. Kaye tracked time and acceleration instead, which told her they were somewhere in the old warehouse district east of Aldgate, in a building that required a key card for the lift and had recently replaced its stairwell lighting, because the fluorescents on the 3rd floor were still the cool, blue-white of new installation against the warmer aging yellow of every floor below. The room they brought her to was not what she expected. No theater. No orchestrated intimidation, no single chair under a light, no men arranged for maximum psychological effect. Just a long table, a detailed map of Greater London subdivided into territories with the clean, unsentimental markings of someone who thought about geography the way generals did, and Indro Falassi standing at its edge in a fresh shirt, whiskey in hand, watching her take it all in. 5 minutes, he said. Not a challenge. A genuine offer. Kaye approached the table. She looked at the map the way she looked at every room, not emotionally, not impressively, just completely. The territory boundaries first, then the annotations, then the places where the annotations were conspicuously absent, which were always more informative than the places where they weren't. "Your eastern distribution point," she said, at the 90-second mark, touching a junction near Stratford. "Whoever runs it has been skimming the reporting by approximately 15% and compensating by inflating the rival activity logs. The numbers balance, but the pattern is wrong. He's been doing it long enough to feel safe." Indro said nothing. "The man coordinating your Southwark arrangement isn't coordinating it for you anymore." She moved her finger south of the river. "He's coordinating it for whoever gave him the better offer. Probably 3 months ago, based on how the boundary here has drifted without any recorded conflict to explain the shift." She paused at the 3rd marker for slightly longer. "This one required more care to deliver. And the person you trust most in this room," she looked up at him, "isn't in this room tonight. Which means they knew I'd be here. And chose not to come." The silence that followed was of a specific quality. Indro Falassi set down his whiskey. The alert took 72 hours to travel from a facial recognition node embedded in a Mayfair traffic camera to a server that officially did not exist, and from that server to a man sitting in a ministerial building on Whitehall who read the notification with the focused stillness of someone receiving exactly the news they had spent 3 years dreading. Deputy Director Harlan Voss closed the alert, opened it again, closed it. Then he made a call to a number that did not appear in any government directory, spoken in the careful, uninflected tone of a man who had long ago separated his professional decisions from anything resembling emotion. "She's been found," he said. "Clean it." The cleaner's name was not Marcus Hale, but that was the name on the 3 passports in his jacket, which was itself a kind of professional statement, redundancy as habit, options as instinct. He had been operating in the gray architecture between intelligence services and organized crime for 11 years, hired precisely because he existed in neither world completely and could therefore move through both without triggering the sensors that governed each. He was not brutal. Brutality was inefficiency dressed as strength. He was methodical, which was considerably more dangerous. He arrived at the Marble Arch on a Thursday evening and asked for a table near the bar. He ordered Bordeaux he didn't drink and scallops he didn't eat and spent 90 minutes being exactly the kind of unremarkable wealthy patron the room was designed to accommodate. He noted the camera positions, the staff rotations, the precise intervals at which the VIP section changed its serving personnel. He noted which waitress moved through the room with a fraction too much spatial awareness for someone whose job required none. He noted Kaye Grant at the 40-minute mark. Not from her face. The facial recognition had done that already, and he had memorized the photo before destroying it. He noted her from the way she positioned herself near table 7 with her back to the wall and a clear sight line to both exits, a habit so deeply encoded it had apparently survived 3 years of civilian cover without erosion. Old training died hard. He left a 20-pound tip and stepped into the Mayfair evening and sent a single message. Confirmed. Thursday next. Clean and quiet. Across the city, in a room above an Aldgate warehouse, a map of London sat on a long table. Kaye Grant had 48 hours she didn't yet know she was counting. The meeting on the 31st floor had been Indra's idea, which meant the ambush was partly his fault, a fact Kaye did not raise because there was no productive moment in which to raise it. They had come to meet a property lawyer with connections to the Shadow Bureau's financial infrastructure, a thread Kaye had pulled from the Southwark discrepancy, following the money through 3 shell companies until it surfaced here. In a glass-walled office tower in Canary Wharf, where everything was chrome and transparency and the engineered illusion of having nothing to hide. The lawyer had not been present. For men had been, arranged with the professional geometry of people who had been briefed on Indra's capabilities and had planned accordingly. They were in the stairwell now, door wedged, buying minutes. Ground exit, Indra said. It was not a question. It was a man accustomed to solving problems in straight lines. Covered, Kaye said. Loading bay also. They've done this before. She moved to the stairwell wall and pressed her palm flat against the concrete, a gesture that looked instinctive because it was. The building's structural core ran through this section. She had noted it from the blueprints she'd pulled on the drive over, the habit of reading a building before entering it being one she'd never successfully retired. Glass tower, concrete spine. The wharf's particular geography, meaning the eastern face, looked directly across a narrow service corridor to an identical building, close enough that sound behaved strangely between them, bouncing and compressing in ways that the architects had considered aesthetically and the acousticians had not considered at all. How many of them have radios? She asked. Indra thought for exactly the right amount of time. All 4. Analog or encrypted? A pause. Analog. Old habit. Kaye almost smiled. She took Indra's radio, lifted from one of the 4 during the initial 30 seconds of chaos that had preceded the stairwell, and adjusted the frequency with the careful precision of someone who had spent 18 months studying how urban sound behaved in dense financial districts, a specialization that had seemed abstract until this exact moment. She transmitted 6 seconds of static on a frequency that, bouncing between the 2 glass faces of adjacent towers, would register to analog receivers throughout the building's lower floors as an evacuation tone. Below them, she heard doors open. Now, she said, we walk out through the front. They didn't speak about it in the car. The debrief happened later, in the Aldgate room, and was brief and functional. Threats neutralized, lawyer disappeared. Next steps. And then Indra's men filtered out with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that some conversations required fewer witnesses. Kaye was gathering her notes from the table when Indra set down a photograph beside the map. A girl. 11, perhaps 12, dark-haired with her father's precise, evaluating eyes set into a face that had not yet learned to make them unreadable. School uniform. A garden somewhere in the background, green and ordinary and aggressively peaceful. Sophia, Indra said. Not an explanation. Just the name, offered with the particular economy of a man who rarely gave anything without purpose. Kaye looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked at him. She doesn't know, he said. What I am. What this is. She thinks her father runs property. A pause. She is 12 next month. She wants to study law. The specific weight of that landed in the room without requiring commentary. He had been moving assets for 8 months, he told her, quietly, carefully, restructuring the legitimate holdings that formed the surface layer of the Flossie operation into something that could survive sunlight. Hotels. Logistics. A wine import business in Tuscany that was genuinely, straightforwardly a wine import business. The goal was not redemption. He was too precise a thinker for that. The goal was extraction, a clean architectural separation between what he had built and what Sophia would inherit. The problem was the Shadow Bureau. They held documentation. 11 years of curated intelligence that could not withstand scrutiny because half of it had been manufactured by Voss to serve his own arrangements, evidence that implicated the Flossie family in operations they had not conducted, structured specifically to ensure Indro could never approach legitimate institutions without being destroyed by the files waiting for him. Kaye sat down slowly. She looked at the map, at the photograph, at the financial records she had been building for 3 weeks, threading the Shadow Bureau's money through its own labyrinthine infrastructure. He built the cage using fraudulent documentation, she said, almost to herself. Then, quieter. Fraudulent documentation can be proven fraudulent. She reached for her notes. We don't go around the law, she said. We hand Voss to it. Every fabricated file becomes evidence of the fabrication. She looked up at Indro. Sophia studies law. Let's give her something worth studying. Sophia studies law. Let's give her something worth studying. That single line just changed everything. Kaye isn't just helping Indro survive anymore. She's helping him build a legacy for his daughter. If your heart is pounding right now, you understand what's at stake. This is no longer about evading assassins and dismantling corrupt agencies. This is about redemption, about turning the weapons used against them into instruments of justice. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next, the masquerade, the takedown, the checkmate, will leave you breathless. They're about to hand the Shadow Bureau to the very law it corrupted. She had not slept that night. Not from fear. Fear was a signal, and signals were useful, and she had learned to metabolize fear into function years before the agency had given her a desk and a clearance level and a very particular set of responsibilities. She had not slept because she was thinking, and the thinking would not stop, and the conclusion it kept returning to was one she needed to be absolutely certain of before she acted on it, because acting on it incorrectly would be indistinguishable from not acting at all. The Copenhagen Summit Threat Matrix had been routine work. She had been handed 17 variables and asked to produce a risk architecture, the usual cartography of potential violence, mapping who in a room full of diplomats and power brokers might constitute a threat and from which direction and by which method. She had done it 40 times. She had done it without looking up from her second coffee. The anomaly was small. A single intelligence report, filed 8 months prior, describing a planned interdiction of a Baltic shipping route used by 3 separate criminal organizations. The report cited a source inside the Flossie network. The report had been used to justify a surveillance operation that had, on paper, yielded nothing. Kaye had cross-referenced the source code. The source did not exist. Had never existed. The report was a fabrication, authored to justify a surveillance operation that had not been targeting the Flossie network at all. It had been targeting a separate cell, a genuine one, whose intelligence had then been quietly redirected into a private arrangement that benefited precisely one person in the agency's upper architecture. Deputy Director Harlan Voss had built his entire secondary operation on the reliable foundation of everyone around him doing their jobs too well to look sideways at his. She had sat at her desk at 4 a.m. with this knowledge arranged in front of her like a proof, clean and irrefutable, and understood 3 things simultaneously. That she was correct. That correctness was not protection. And that the man who had recruited her, mentored her, written the commendation that had elevated her clearance 18 months ago, had done all of those things with the patient deliberateness of someone keeping a useful tool close. She had packed one bag. She had paused at the door of her flat and looked back at the life arranged inside it, the books, the half-finished research, the ordinary geography of a person, and then she had stepped into the November dark and become nobody. She had been surprisingly good at it. Until the whiskey. She was in the building's nervous system, a service room on the mezzanine level housing the audio infrastructure for the Dorchester's Grand Ballroom. Surrounded by patch panels and signal routers and a direct feed from the 16 security cameras covering every angle of the masquerade below. The ballroom was magnificent and deadly in equal measure. 300 guests in masks that rendered facial recognition useless, a string orchestra providing sufficient ambient noise to cover conversation and, incidentally, the sound of a suppressed weapon at close range. Voss had chosen it with the same careful intelligence he applied to everything, which was the first mistake he'd made in 11 years, because careful intelligence had built the room, and considerably more careful intelligence was now dismantling it from 40 feet above. "Northeast corner," she said into the headset. "The waiter who hasn't moved in 11 minutes. He's primary." Indra's voice came back unhurried. "Scene." She had mapped them over 3 hours of preparation, cross-referencing the guest list against known shadow bureau contractors, identifying the staff infiltration points, building a picture of the kill architecture Voss had constructed around the evening's centerpiece. A private meeting room off the ballroom's east corridor where Indra was supposed to finalize a property arrangement and instead encounter something considerably more terminal. There were 5 of them. She found each one the way she found everything, through the gap between what they were pretending to be and what their bodies could not stop being. The orchestra musician whose bow arm was slightly too controlled. The guest near the champagne fountain whose mask had been chosen for peripheral coverage rather than aesthetics. The woman in the green dress whose evening bag sat at precisely the angle of someone who had drawn from it before and was thinking about doing so again. Green dress, 10 o'clock. She's second. She guided Indra through the room like a chess player who could see the entire board, moving him away from sight lines, toward positions of advantage, using the ballroom's columns and the orchestra's crescendos as cover. Each contractor she identified, Indra neutralized with the quiet, absolute efficiency of a man in his natural element. No shots fired. No panic, no disruption to the elegant geometry of the evening. By the time Voss entered the private meeting room, every piece he had placed on the board was gone. Indra was already inside, waiting, in a chair that faced the door. "Checkmate," Kaye said quietly, to no one in particular. 3 months later, Harlan Voss was remanded into custody pending trial on 14 counts of fraud, misconduct in public office, and the manufacture of classified intelligence, the last charge being, as far as Kaye was aware, the first time it had appeared on a British indictment in 30 years. The legal architecture had taken her 6 weeks to construct, built from the fraudulent documentation Voss had spent a decade accumulating, every fabricated file repurposed as evidence of its own fabrication. It was, she thought, the cleanest thing she had ever built. She had watched the arrest from a coffee shop across the street, had finished her espresso, had walked away without looking back. The new lounge had no name yet. It existed in the basement of a Mayfair townhouse that Indra's legitimate property holdings had quietly absorbed, accessible through a door that looked like a wall panel and a staircase lit by a single brass fixture that cast everything in the color of late afternoon. The room below was small and deliberate: 4 tables, a bar of aged walnut, walls lined with something that absorbed sound with the quality of a confidence kept. It smelled of cedar and good leather and the particular stillness of a space that had not yet accumulated its history. Indra was already there when she arrived, which she had expected, because Indra was always already there. He was standing at the bar with a bottle she recognized, the same 30-year-old Scotch, or its twin, amber and unhurried in the low light. He poured 2 glasses with the careful attention of a man who had decided that some things deserved to be done properly. No performance in it. Just precision, which with Indra was the closest thing to tenderness the vocabulary allowed. He set 1 glass at the bar in front of her. She sat, picked it up. The weight of it was clean and certain in her hand, not the off-balance tilt of a tray mid-stumble, not the engineered accident of a woman calculating a sniper's geometry. Just a glass, held by someone who had finally stopped rehearsing exits. She drank. Indra watched her with the expression he reserved for things that had earned his complete attention. "No apron," he said. "No apron," she agreed. Outside, London moved through its vast indifferent evening, and in the basement of an unnamed room in Mayfair, two people who had found each other in the precise moment before catastrophe sat in the particular silence of those who no longer needed to explain themselves. The whiskey was excellent. She didn't spill a drop. What an absolutely extraordinary journey we've just experienced together. From a spilled whiskey to a private lounge with no name. From an agency analyst who had to disappear to a woman who finally stopped running. If you were moved by this story, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales of intelligence, precision, and the kind of connection that only forms between people who see what others miss. Turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. And I have to know what hit you hardest. The whiskey scene? The Sophia revelation? Or that final moment when she didn't spill a drop? Comment below and let's discuss. Your engagement means everything to this channel. Thank you for being here. See you in the next story.